Thank you very much. Today we have a very special guest who's going to give us some background information. He's a retired U.S. Colonel, Lieutenant Robert Ruffalo, U.S. Army retired, and he's the Chief Executive Officer of Global Initiative Consulting Group. Colonel Ruffalo was born in an ancient family from southern Italy and is a retired American Army officer with more than 29 years of distinguished service to the United States. He was selected for diplomatic services as his last military tour and formed Global Initiative Consulting Group, GICG, following his retirement from United States diplomatic mission in Rome, Italy. Robert is recognized subject matter expert in anti-terrorism, having achieved the highest assessment on Defense Threat Reduction Agency, JCIVA. He continued to build superior security program and was later lauded by European Command Inspector General for creating the best 39 embassy security programs across Europe thereafter. Robert is trained in a disaster preparedness response, having directed U.S. Army Japan through 3 earthquakes and 10 typhoon storms, which landed on Japanese shores. He's also an architect of one of the largest supply chain programs in the history of U.S. Army, known as Theater Provider Equipment, TPE program. That program saved the U.S. government more than $48 billion, and that's for sure, $48 billion in strategic lift cost over 10 years, and was recently made program of record by U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Robert has earned the Combat Infantry Badge, 2 Bronze Star medals, and has been knighted 5 times for his service internationally. He also holds a Bachelor of Arts in Modern European History, a Master of Business Administration, and is completing a Master of Policy Leadership at Georgetown University, McCourt School of Public Policy. Thank you very much, Robert, to take the time and talk to us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Robert. Let me ask you a couple questions that I am thinking as the situation you've probably been following in Ethiopia and
Yes.
What's happening over there in the Horn of Africa. I learned from someone in the Ethiopian community here in the U.S. that you have helped our Cagno veterans. Tell us about your experience with the Ethiopian Cagno veterans. What was your impression of our community? And for those younger people who don't know what Cagno Battalion was or Korean War, can you explain to us in short what that is all about?
I'd love to. So it's great to know that you've been doing a little bit of research on my community, my connections with your community, and how important that is. So in fact, I have my Korean War commemorative pin on today for this particular interview. So the Cagno Battalion, also known as the Conquerors, was a battalion formed by the Emperor Haile Selassie. He gave 1,000 soldiers a year for 5 consecutive years as his contribution, and Ethiopia's contribution to the world and world peace, as part of the United Nations force that went to help the South Korean people. Clearly, if you've studied the Korean War, you know that the communist North Koreans conducted an incursion and basically took over most of the South Korean peninsula. And so the UN launched a force to go and to push the communists back. A large portion of the reason why the UN created this force is actually because Emperor Haile Selassie went and he spoke to the UN and said, look, what you did for me in 1940, we must do for other people. We must help the South Koreans. And even though I'm a small country, I'm willing to give 1,000 of my soldiers a year until the war is completed. And he fulfilled that promise, actually. So it was something that was very thrilling as a U.S. Army officer to meet and get to know several of your veterans. So a lot of them actually live in Washington, D.C. And so I had the opportunity through some other friends to get to know these gentlemen, and was a great opportunity. As we kind of talked and got to know each other, I learned that many of them went to Catholic schools in Addis, and they actually speak Italian. So we were in the middle of the Army-Navy Club in Washington, D.C., conducting negotiations for the ceremony, actually in Italian. not in English. So it was a thrilling opportunity for me to meet these guys, not only because they're veterans, but also to listen to their Italian. So for me, it was a very unique experience actually to do that. My impression of the community really blossomed after I was able to conduct this negotiation with them. So I invited 5 or 6 of the veterans who were available actually to the Army Navy Club. It's 200 meters down the street from the White House. And we sat there at a table, and one of the gentlemen actually brought his son. And I'm not going to say what the last name is, but the son's name is Mamo, baby, right? And so Mamo was there, and I was speaking with his father, who was major in the Imperial Army, and he actually earned the Bronze Star. And I turned to him midway through lunch, and I said, tell me about the mission where you led a patrol out, and like 9 guys went out and 10 guys came back. And he looks at me and he says, how do you know that? I said, well, who do I work for? Okay. And he says, never mind, you work for the government, I know. So he actually told the story, and I had read the story actually in the dispatches. So his patrol went out, they went into a trench line, it was a Chinese trench line, and they actually subdued 4 or 5 bunkers. And in one of the bunkers was a very young Chinese boy. So they decided to bring this young man back with them. And so this was the conclusion of the patrol. And the son's looking at me like, okay, how did you find out? It's all good, but fantastic people. Really was a great thrill to get to know them, and then to be able to conduct for them the first ever commemorative parade in Washington, D.C., honoring the service of the CAGNU. So we had, in fact, the Korean embassy, the Italian embassy, the Netherlands embassies, British embassy. We were obviously there, officials from the Pentagon, as well as the Ethiopian embassy participated as well. It was really a wonderful ceremony. And interestingly, that same gentleman, when we did the celebration, we had also invited the 7th Infantry Division, which was the unit that they were attached to in Korea. And so the president of the Association of the 7th Infantry Division veterans, now you have to understand, they're both probably about 88, 89 years old at this point, right?
Yes.
And he's standing there and he's looking at this guy, Ethiopian, the major, and he's looking back at them, and they said, you are so-and-so. They hadn't seen each other since 1953. So the first time they're looking at each other is in 2012, and they recognized each other. That tells you the spirit and the power of that community. It's absolutely a community to be honored and to be remembered forever by the Ethiopian people because of their sacrifices for the culture and the people of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Colonel. I know you served as a policy planner on both the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, and the multinational forces in Iraq stuff. How did those experiences shape you, and how would you apply those experiences in the current day Ethiopia?
So both of those experiences were important to my professional development because as a mid-grade major, I'd already served on a variety of lower level staffs. This was a 4-star level diplomatic staff. So this was actually the first opportunity for me to work with diplomats and with embassies and to understand the planning process, the intergovernmental planning process that occurs between diplomats and other ministries. So in this case, we were actually helping the Iraqi people to reformulate a government using the ministerial system. They'd already had something like that, but obviously under the previous regime that was there, without using the gentleman's name, things were probably not as egalitarian and were not as free as they could be. Now, there's a lot of development that has to go along with forming a new ministry, a lot of procedures, paperwork, forms. I mean, it's bureaucracy, right? So there's going to be forms for everything. So my particular task associated with this was security infrastructure, as well as, strangely, museum planning. And I think that had to do with my degree in history, modern European history. So I was selected to try to come up with policy papers and programs on how to restart the Iraqi museum industry, because we learned after the CPA actually produced some stabilization in central Baghdad and southern Iraq, that Saddam had actually not destroyed any of the ancient artifacts. So many of the artifacts of Ur and Sumeria were still there. They were boxed up because he didn't have the proper structure to be able to create real museums at the time, right? So understanding that there are all of these treasures, thousands of years old. So if we consider Ethiopia and King Solomon and the historic beginning of today's Ethiopia, 3,000 years ago, even before that time, there are relics in Iraq from, really the old portions of whatever text that you study. There's the possibility to create tourism, right? And with tourism comes a lot of dollars. Obviously, there are programs that you can set up to help children. There are universities that would love to be able to bring students and study and to conduct study for thesis, as well as just average tourism. So looking at that and understanding the gifts that Ethiopia has, I mean, one of the most fantastic things that you have in the country is obviously Lalibela, right? So who has a church carved out of one single block of stone? You're the only country that has that. That would be something that the world should absolutely see. You have a lot of UNESCO sites in Ethiopia, and those are very important things to spotlight and to highlight. But to have that and to have successful tourism, you must also have a form of security. So that was the other part of my mission in Iraq, was to try to help establish security, because stability comes from security. But you need something to pay for security, and that's generally commerce. So as historians, if we study as a great model the grand strategy of the Roman Empire, the Roman army at its peak was unbeatable. But the Roman army was funded by Roman commerce and trade. So you've got to have commerce and trade to fund the army, but the army gives you the security and the stability to have open commerce and trade. They mutually support each other, where traditionally, perhaps in government planning, we look and we say, oh, well, that's the military guys. No, they have to work in concert together. That's very important to create that type of stability and security. And I think that Ethiopia, looking at what's recently happened today, in fact, there were some large skirmishes, and I think perhaps we're at the end of this issue with the TPLF, that potentially we are now turning the corner, and there's a great possibility for us to start to engage in the dialogue of commerce and security concentrically. Long answer to the question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Colonel. You also served as a U.S. diplomat in Rome. How does your diplomatic tour improve an official understanding of government roles and function? How could you apply that to the programs in Ethiopia?
So, fantastic question. Having served on the CPA and the Multinational Force Iraq staff with those diplomats, I was not exposed at the level to understand the mechanisms of diplomacy and how diplomacy is a tremendous tool for positive relationships, commercial relationships, military relationships. When we talk about military relationships, we're talking about exercises and exchanges and schooling, providing perhaps positions for Ethiopian officers to come to the United States to study in our universities and many of our war colleges. That's a great exchange. So that's another part of the diplomatic aspects of my tour. But what it also taught me is the interactions and how to employ the diplomatic system in a positive way. An example, let's assume that we want to make a modification to the existing U.S.-Ethiopia defense treaty. Well, those negotiators meet every 2 years, and I think they last met last year. One of the mechanisms that would be appropriate to reopen that would be if the Ethiopian ambassador in Washington was to ask Secretary Pompeo for the opportunity to discuss an expanded treaty. Now, some people may say, oh my God, an expanded defense treaty. No, you have to understand that when we talk about exercises, as an example, the United States before the Gulf War was conducting a biannual exercise that was conducted in Egypt, and it's called Bright Star. And you would assemble 15 or 16 different nations, and you go through a variety of defensive operations, and you're doing training missions, right? So there's a training exchange that occurs. But along with that, of course, there's logistics sustainment that has to occur, okay? Because you've got a lot of forces. We would bring in the neighborhood of 50,000 people into Egypt for roughly about 60 days. Now, the bulk of those people are there in the middle 4 weeks of the exercise, but the logisticians, the professional logisticians, come 2 weeks before, set everything up, do all the contracting, and then at the end leave. So by having this kind of diplomatic opportunity, perhaps having exercises in Ethiopia, tremendous opportunities in terms of also funding. I mean, Bright Star is funded at a rate of $80 million every 2 years. So we'd have to buy food and supplies and sustainment from the local economy. So that's a huge boost to the economy.
Thank you very much, Colonel. What do you feel are the main causes of the conflict that's happening now in northern Ethiopia, and particularly in the region?
We talked just briefly, we've already spoken about the strategy of the Roman Empire and commerce and security. So I think one of the things, having observed your community since 2012, both as a friend of the community, but also as a diplomat and a government planner, I think that the question is how do you provide great commercial opportunities to the Ethiopian people and at the same time provide them security? Because a lot of people, when we say security, they think about armed people or police, and that's not the full aspect of security. Having a job that gives you a good wage, that allows you to have a nice home and to support your family, is also another form of security. Okay, so one of the things we have to focus on, I think, would be to provide additional industrial opportunities, commercial opportunities, agricultural opportunities to Ethiopia. Everyone knows that you have some of the best coffee in the world. Well, is there a way perhaps that we can expand that particular agricultural production, also perhaps invest in maybe roasting machines so that we can not only harvest the beans, but roast the beans on site, and then package the beans and then ship them directly to a variety of coffee houses, okay? There are some additional industries that I think that can be expanded, as well as a discussion of Ethiopia's rare earth elements. You have a variety of rare earth elements that I think would be very interesting to many Western corporations. And I think that you would probably find a more suitable, well-balanced, perhaps business deal with some of the Western countries, as opposed to some of your other partners.
Yeah, thank you, Colonel. The federal government in Ethiopia is saying that it's a law enforcement action that is taking place right now in Ethiopia. How do you feel about that?
When you look at the films, depending on what your political slant is, and everyone has a political slant, some people will make it out to be warfare, other people make it out to be something else. If we use a traditional doctrinal approach to the conflict, it really is a peace enforcement operation, okay? And then becomes later perhaps a peacekeeping mission. Clearly, I mean, my question would be, what is the necessity for all of these individual militias? I understand that you have more than 80 tribes in Ethiopia. If we consider also, if I may use the term, the other Ethiopic people, Eritrea, some people in Djibouti, you have some people in some of the other neighboring countries, Somaliland, largely from the beginning, you all share some common DNA. So if I could use the term Ethiopic to describe all of those people, I would say that in these areas, you've got a large number of militias. And if the central government is providing security, both in terms of labor and job potentials and investment, as well as police and military, traditional military, I don't understand the need for these types of militias. What I'm hoping is that we get beyond this sensation where we have to defend ourselves. When you talk about the law enforcement aspects, I would preferably refer you to the Carabinieri as an example. The Italian government has a formal military police force. So they are real law enforcement officers. They go to a one-year jurisprudence academy, but they're also trained to do military style techniques. Now, what does that mean? How to do checkpoints, how to do a variety of military operations that support the army. They are not the army, okay? So they are a full jurisprudence law enforcement entity. One of the things that they do very well is if you are a Carabinieri, and let's say you live in Venice and you join the Carabinieri in Venice, they don't let you stay in Venice. They send you to Sicily for your first 2 tours. So then you are not loyal to the Venetian people. You're not focused on your own people in your village. You're focused on the actual policing of the citizens where you're living and you're garrisoned. That changes, for me, the optic because they're now focused on A, being a good carabinieri, B, following the law, C, protecting the people that they are deputed to protect where they are. That's something that I think would eliminate the need for militias. So if you were, as an example, your national police force, take policemen from the west side of the country and put them on the east side of the country, okay, the language is a little different, the culture is a little different, the people are a little different, perhaps the food is a lot different, but they're then focused on being a police officer. They're not focused on being a militia to protect X. My
Thank
opinion.
you very much. Thank you very much. What do you think is the government doing right now to make sure that they are protecting the civilians as they try to extract some of this renegade TPLF elements? What are they doing to protect the civilians in Tigray?
Okay, so I guess my first response to this would be, this is my opinion. I do not represent the American government. I don't represent any formal agency. This is just my personal opinion. I think that the government is doing their best to try to protect the civil population. I think that Prime Minister Abiy has some very good ideas and he has good intent. I think that he's facing some very difficult situations because of the years and years of governmental changes that occurred after the departure of the emperor. And I think that he's trying to piece together a cogent government that is strong centrally, but also allows regional governments to properly administer and govern their people. That's very difficult to do unless you've got great commercial investment in the country, because all of that takes funding and takes opportunity. And I think that it's time for business leaders and time for governmental leaders in Ethiopia to reach out to their friends and partners in the West and ask for help. That doesn't, if you ask for help, it doesn't mean I'm coming to do it for you. It means I'll give you some advisors. That's traditionally how governments function. And of course, that would incentivize large business leaders and business owners in the West to come and be interested in investing. Okay, we talked briefly about coffee and coffee manufacture and perhaps roasting plants. If we understood as business leaders that there were opportunities in Ethiopia, secure opportunities, I think that you'd get a lot of people would be very interested in coming and invest in Ethiopia. It's an extremely important country. It's one of the oldest countries on the continent. And I would have to tell, well, you have great food. So as an Italian, I have to tell you that I really like going and eating Ethiopian food. So that's always very good. Injera is one of my favorite things, but it makes me a little fat. I got to be honest with you, because I have a tendency to overeat if I go to your restaurants. But there's huge opportunities. And I think that we've got to reach out through the commercial attaches. And that's done normally through your embassy in the capitals to their corresponding partners in the various ministries. Huge opportunities.
Thank you, Colonel. One last question. How do you see this campaign ending in Ethiopia? And what do you think will be the short-term and long-term strategy for the country, the Abiy Ahmed and the rest of them, law enforcement?
Okay, so when we speak about campaigns, I'm not just hearing from you the military campaign or the law enforcement campaign or the peace enforcement campaign, depending on which side of military doctrine you choose to apply to this situation. I think that there needs to be a variety of campaigns. There needs to be a commercial campaign. There needs to be a tourism campaign. There needs to be an industrial campaign, okay? There also needs to be a infrastructure campaign to fix the infrastructure. If you want to do those other things that we just talked about, you've got to have some good infrastructures, and you've got to have top-level hotels, top-level airports, okay, as well as good road network, rail network, so that you can move around the country, because you want people to see the country. It's a beautiful country. So I think you've got to work on those campaigns, but you also have to work on a defense campaign. And the defense campaign is partner with people. And an example of that could be, the U.S. government is talking about moving U.S. African Command, AFRICOM, from Germany, and they're looking for another place to put it. To me, a natural place to put it would be near Addis. So you're talking about moving 1,000 U.S. families with a budget of over $1 billion a year. That's a huge opportunity for Ethiopia. And it's not an occupying force, it's a headquarters. So it's all senior level people. Average age is around 40 years old. Most of them are married with children. And they've got the ability to go out and spend on the economy and to invest in the country. I think tremendous opportunity for Africa to get it there. And I think that you have already a diplomatic body that exists in Addis. I think they put a statue up of His Imperial Majesty recently. So, you already have the footprint for that kind of an organization to be there. So I think by having a large planning headquarters, that really would tremendously benefit Africa, and it would tremendously help Ethiopia in terms of stability. That's my opinion. That's not from the government.
Thank you very much, Connor Ruffello, for your time and for your love and care for our people. And I know this is not going to be our last meeting. We'll be talking more about it. And thank you very much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about my great Ethiopian friends. And I hope to see you again soon.
You're welcome.